Greetings, everyone. Good evening. Class will come to order. Well, that doesn't work in the class I teach. We are, of course, embarked on Purdue's sesquicentennial 150th anniversary, and as I hope everyone here knows, have chosen to commemorate it with a year-long Ideas Festival, inviting the best and brightest minds we can find on a variety of topics to our campus, and to discuss where technology is taking us and what it means. This is not a new idea at Purdue, and tonight's today and tomorrow's event, Dawn or Doom, our fifth such meeting, is a major major fixture in this year's event, but it also was a prototype, really, for all the events that we've been having and those that are to come. 100 years ago, the world was also in a time of incredible scientific transformation, new inventions, every bit as remarkable to the people of that time as the ones we've been experiencing, were everywhere. The steam engine, the railroad, telegraph, telephone, electricity, the sewing machine, things were changing people's lives in a very, very direct way. And many people came to the conclusion that science was infallibly benevolent and benign and would lead humanity straight upward. And then a few years later, millions were dead at the hands of that technology, which had outrun people's ability to understand its implications. And so it behooves us to take some time, especially at this place, where so many of the breakthroughs of today and tomorrow are happening and are being born. It's natural that we would have a curiosity about technology, its pros, its cons, and its possible, the possible difficulties it brings. Some of us think we have an obligation, a responsibility to think as deeply about those questions as anybody anywhere. And so tonight and tomorrow are very much a part of that, really a template for all the discussions of this sesquicentennial year. So first of all of you who have come to attend and the even larger crowds we'll have with us tomorrow. Special thanks to the organizers, the conceivers of this particular event, and to the participants who have joined us from elsewhere. I'm looking forward with special enthusiasm to the lecture this evening. Let me bring on to introduce our guest, the chairman, I guess you'd say, certainly the driving force in all 5 Dawn or Doom conferences, to whom we are all tremendously indebted, Jerry McCartney.
Thank you. Let me just do a little housekeeping first. Nick Carr's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then he'll be happy to take questions from the audience. I would ask you, because we're recording the event, that you would line up behind these mics here on either side. Nick will indicate when he's ready to start taking questions. Also, while I've got you here, please silence all your electronic devices, but feel free to tweet to #DawnOrDoom. Artists from the Ink Factory will be, as they have been all day, joining us to create visual recaps of the talks of our presenters, and you're welcome to take pictures and share them on social media. And don't be afraid to chat with the artist and ask questions when they are finished drawing. Nicholas Carr is an acclaimed writer on technology and culture whose books include the Pulitzer Prize finalist and New York Times bestseller, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. What the internet is doing to our brains is actually rewiring them, Carr says, pointing to a growing body of research indicating this, while changing the way we read, write, and think, and not for the better. Nick Carr has written, among others, for The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Wired, Nature, the MIT Technology Review, and has been writing his popular Rough Type Technology blog since 2005. His essays have been collected in several anthologies, including The Best American Science and Nature Writing and The Best Technology Writing. He has lectured at MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, Dartmouth, the University of Pennsylvania, Notre Dame, Williams College, NASA, and the Newberry Library, among other schools and institutions. The Christian Science Monitor calls his latest book, Utopia is Creepy, a greatest hits album of pieces poking holes in Silicon Valley's cheery and unremitting vision of our technological future. Carr's prime targets are those who believe so fervently in computers and data that they abandon common sense. Cheap digital tools do not make us all the next Fellini or Dylan, neither Bob nor Thomas. Social networks, diverting as they may be, are not vehicles for self-enlightenment, and likes and retweets are not going to elevate political discourse, a view for which there is ample current evidence. Only by recognizing how technology amplifies our worst as well as our best traits, Carr says, can we begin to make better decisions about how we design and use smartphones, social media, and other digital products. Many will recognize Nick's title as derived from Hobbes' Leviathan, and if I may, I'll add Hobbes' original first word back in. Life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Earlier today, I mentioned Vonnegut's 1952 novel, Play a Piano, and I'll take another line from that prescient work. Machines have robbed the American people of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So where does that leave us now? Automation deprives individuals of their physical striving. We now pay money to exercise our bodies. Mass communications have ironically made us more surrounded only by people like us. And now these attractive and addictive machines are apparently reducing our ability to think. So I am delighted to be able to welcome Nick Carr, who will present his talk entitled Nasty, Brutish, and Dumb, Humans and Their Phones. Thank you and enjoy.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, President Daniels. Thanks to all of you for spending some of your afternoon here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to visit Purdue and participate in this year's Dawn or Doom conference. I actually span both categories because I believe we're just at the dawn of doom. But I'll get back to that later. And it's also an honor to be able to share some of my ideas with you, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. I'll begin with what I think is something we can all agree on, and that's that digital media, over the course of a very, very short period, just the last 20 years, and particularly the last 10 or 5 years, with the rise to prominence of social media and the smartphone, have changed the way we live. They've really altered the texture and the pace of our day-to-day lives, and they've certainly altered the way we inform ourselves and the way we converse with others. I think you'd have to go back 100 years to the period of electrification and the rise of the automobile to really find new technologies that have had such a deep effect on people's everyday lives. I would argue that the entire edifice of digital media has been built on two assumptions. The first equates information with knowledge. If we can give people more information more quickly, then those people will become smarter, better informed, and broader minded. And the second assumption equates communication with community. If we give people more opportunities and more tools for expressing themselves publicly and sharing their thoughts and ideas with one another publicly, then people will become more empathetic, more sympathetic, more understanding, and society as a whole will become more harmonious. These two assumptions are, first of all, they're very, very idealistic. Second, they're very deeply embedded in Silicon Valley, both Silicon Valley's ideology about how people should live and Silicon Valley's business, which is built around increasing the flow of information, increasing the intensity of communication. And by a kind of process of cultural osmosis, these two assumptions have also come to be widely accepted by the general public. There's only one problem. Both of the assumptions are false. And I think it's our inability to see that early on, to realize that these assumptions go against what we know from our own common sense and also what we know about human nature in general, is one of the reasons that we're now struggling with all sorts of problems that social media and the smartphone have opened up. Problems in our individual lives, problems in our social lives, our political lives, and that's what I'd like to talk about for the next few minutes. And I'll start by looking at that first assumption, the one that confuses information with knowledge. On the one hand, we can all understand why we would think in those terms, because after all, information is the raw material you need to create personal knowledge. You have to think about something. But what we miss in that is the reality of the situation, which is that in order to transform mere information into knowledge, requires a process that actually is interrupted by the technology. And we know that because we know how that process works inside our minds. To turn information into knowledge means taking in information and transitioning it over to your long-term memory. From your working memory, which is kind of the inbox of your mind, what you're consciously thinking about, to that long-term memory, that process, which is a process called memory consolidation, is the way that you connect new facts and new experiences to everything else you've ever known. And it's those connections among all the things held inside your memory, those associations, that really is the source of personal knowledge. It's not being able to grab the fact that answers the well-defined question at any given moment, something Google, for instance, is very good at. It's the ability to weave information into true knowledge that gives us the ability to think conceptually, to think critically, in many cases to think creatively as well. If you think about the smartphone, you very quickly realize that it's incredibly powerful in distributing information, but it breaks the chain of concentration and attentiveness required to turn that information into knowledge. Because another thing we know about how the brain works is that the whole process of memory consolidation hinges on attentiveness. You only create rich associations with new information coming into your mind when you attend to that information, when you focus on it and concentrate on it carefully. It's then that not only you get these rich connections, but that this information stays deep in your mind and becomes part of this flexible set of knowledge that you can apply to all sorts of new problems and new challenges. And with the smartphone, we've essentially created a device that is incredibly powerful at interrupting us, at breaking our attention through its notifications, its alerts, its buzzes and beeps and everything else, and the fact that we carry it with us all the time. From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed at night, it's usually within arm's reach, if not in our hand. We've begun to see from research how this is affecting us and how it is diminishing, I think, our intellect and our knowledge. Back in 2009, almost 10 years ago, the first major study of digital media was done at Stanford University. The researchers got a bunch of people, about half of them identified as heavy screen users, computer users, internet users, and the other half were much lighter users of the technology. The heavy users they called, I think, heavy media multitaskers, and the others they called light media multitaskers. They gave both sets of people a set of 6 fundamental tests of mental function, of how well they were able to control their mind, solve problems, and so on. And what they found is that in all 6 of the tests, the heavy media multitaskers did worse than the light media multitaskers. They were less able to maintain their concentration, less able to resist distraction, less able to differentiate important stuff worth focusing on, from trivia that really they should have let pass by, and even worse at multitasking itself. The more you multitask, weirdly enough, the worse you get at it. And what one of the lead researchers explained was that everything distracts these people. And what he meant was that as you adapt to this technology of distraction, what grabs your attention isn't what's important, it's simply what's new. The latest thing to come across your screen, the latest notification, the latest message from a friend, or whatever. Now that was, as I said, that was done 9 years ago, those experiments, before the smartphone and social media like Facebook and Snapchat and so forth basically took over what we mean by personal computing. Since then, we've seen a lot more of experiments along those lines. And as you can imagine, they show that with the smartphone, those distractions, because the smartphone is unlike the laptop or the desktop, the smartphone is always with us, always on, always connected, and always kind of tapping at our shoulder. The distractions are more, the costs in terms of cognitive power are more, but that in a sense is expected. If the computer itself had those effects, we would expect the smartphone to have even worse effects. What's even more interesting is some recent research that's coming out that shows that the effects of having a smartphone around go much deeper than just the distractions that come with calls or alerts or notifications and so forth. Last year, there was a study published that was done by a team of researchers led by a cognitive psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, that in this research, they gathered a group of 500 people, 500 students, and they gave them 2 tests of basic intellectual function. One was a test of what's called working memory capacity, basically how much brain power you can apply to a given problem or a given task in front of you. And the other was a test of fluid intelligence, your ability to make sense of a situation or problem you've never seen before. Essentially, these are tests of intelligence, very standard tests. So they gave these tests to these 500 people, and the only thing that differed was where the people's phones were when they took the tests. One group had their phone with them and actually sitting in view on the desk as they did the tests. But, and this is a very important point, the phone was turned off completely. But it was just sitting there within view. Another group had their phone with them, but it was out of sight in their pocket or in their bag next to them. And the third group had their phones outside in a different room. It turned out that there was a big, significant difference in how these people performed. The ones who did best on the 2 tests were the ones whose phone was outside of the room. The ones who did in the middle were the ones who had their phones with them, but hidden from their view. And the ones who did the worst by a significant margin were the ones who had their phones in view. Now, as I say, all of these phones were turned off for this test. It was just the proximity of the device that influenced how the people thought and how they performed. It was almost as if, as your phone gets closer to you, it kind of sucks more brain power out of your skull into the phone. In these results, this was a very good test, very well-designed test, and these results have been confirmed by other experiments. Also last year, there was a similar research published. It was undertaken, it was conducted at the University of Arkansas, one of the campuses of the University of Arkansas. And in this case, they did something very similar. They had a group of people take a test, but it was a test in a real-world situation. People came in and listened to a college lecture. I think there were about 140 or 150 people in the test. And then afterward, they took an exam that measured their ability to recall and retain the information in the lecture. It was a complex lecture and a difficult test. What they found is students who leave their phones outside of the classroom scored a whole letter grade higher on the exam than the students who had their phones with them. And it didn't matter whether they used the phones or didn't use the phones. They all performed equally poorly. So kind of, what Jerry said in the start here, that, silence your phones. I'm glad you did, but on the other hand, it probably doesn't make a big difference. You're probably all a little bit stupider because you have your phones with you. I hate to deliver the bad news. And so, as I say, this is kind of a weird phenomenon, that this object, when you're not using it, when it's not doing anything, could have such a deep effect on your cognition. But in fact, it fits with what we know about psychology. Psychologists know that our minds are monitoring systems as well as thinking systems, and we're always kind of keeping track of what's around us in our surroundings. And this goes back to very primitive days when, to stay alive, you had to monitor what was going on around you because you wanted to identify threats or opportunities very, very quickly. And so you can see, for instance, a classic example is if you have parents with a newborn baby, and the baby is with them in the room, even if the baby is sleeping quietly, a lot of their attention, even if they're not aware of it, goes toward monitoring that baby. They want to know any peep the baby makes or any move, and they keep kind of repressing the desire to run over and look at the baby or wake the baby up. The baby, psychologists say, has a high degree of salience in the environment. Well, think about what we've constructed with our smartphones. And this is turned off, but I can actually feel it sucking the brain out of me. So I'm going to be a little more stupid for the next couple of minutes, but it's important to make the point. Think of what we've done in constructing the smartphone. What the smartphone represents to us. Well, it's our mailbox, it's our photo album, it's our shopping mall, it's our television, it's our radio, it's our newspaper, and it's also, and most importantly, it's kind of a party where everyone we know is attending and talking about things all the time. So it has a very high degree of social content, which is particularly important in measuring an object's salience, because we're very social animals. So we've taken all of these different things that are important to us and that are changing all the time and that are interesting to us, and we've compressed them into this little device that we carry around with us all day long. As Adrian Ward, the guy who led the University of Texas study, said, this is an object of supernormal salience. And so it's no surprise that even if we're unconscious of the pull it has on us, it's taking away a substantial amount of our brain power whenever it's around, for the simple reason that either we're using it, or we're thinking about using it, or we're suppressing the desire to think about using it. And it's almost as if we've created, or the tech companies have created, because of course they want us to be this deeply engaged with it, we've created the perfect device for keeping us distracted and continually interrupting us. So if you think about digital media as a whole, you can see that it's a technology optimized for information delivery, and it does that very, very well, and we can all be thankful for that. But it's also a device that is designed to hinder our ability to take that information and actually transform it into deep, interesting knowledge that we can then apply to all sorts of purposes in our lives. Now let's move on to the second assumption, the one that equates communication with community. Again, this kind of makes sense. You would think that if we are able to speak to each other, communicate with each other, then we'll get to know one another. We will get more empathetic, and ultimately we'll all be a kind of big, happy family. And you can see this idea run throughout kind of Western thinking for at least the last 100 years, throughout the period when we've had new communication systems. Every time a new one comes around, there's this sense that this will solve all problems and all stresses and strains in society, and we'll all come together in this peaceful union of harmony. And I can read you a quote from the New York Times. The internet has ruined my memory, so I can't remember it, but I'll read it to you. A quote from the New York Times in 1899 that was in an article about the laying of transatlantic communication cables, telegraph cables. And the writer said, "Nothing so fosters and promotes a mutual understanding in a community of sentiment and interests as cheap, speedy, and convenient communication." The same thing, in slightly different words, is said throughout this past century whenever a new communication system, whether it's radio or the telephone, television, personal computers, you see this over and over again. the fact that the last century is marked by 2 horrendous world wars, concentration camps, other brutalities, doesn't seem to dent the idealism that these communication systems will solve all social strains. And you see it very much in the rhetoric of social media companies. Mark Zuckerberg says variations on this theme whenever he opens his mouth. And I'll give you one example. He recently said, "People sharing more creates a more open culture and leads to a better understanding of the lives and perspectives of others." Well, if this technology promoted social understanding and social harmony, then we should really be in the midst of a massive outbreak of peace, love, and understanding today in the world. And I think, if anything, we seem to be experiencing the opposite, a time of great fractiousness, people unable to appreciate other people's points of view, yelling at one another, emotional responses to things rather than rational, and huge fissures in society that seem to be opening. In fact, we shouldn't be surprised, because if you look at the evidence from psychologists and sociologists, you find that actually, on balance, the more we communicate with other people, the less likely those people are to like us. In fact, communication, on balance, slightly increases the probability that someone will grow to dislike you. There was this very interesting study, I think it was done in the 70s by some Harvard psychologists, that looked at just this question. They had people communicate information with one another, and they measured the attitudes between them. And they found that, indeed, people were more likely to dislike someone the more they knew about that person. And they summarized this pretty dark stuff, but it's true. They summarized it this way: although people believe that knowing leads to liking, knowing more means liking less. And they even found something that they termed dissimilarity cascades. What that means is, the more information you get about someone, the more likely you are to emphasize dissimilarities over similarities. So when you just know a little about someone, you kind of seek out evidence that they're like you. But when you get more and more information, you begin to put more and more emphasis on where they diverge from you and the differences they have with you. There was another study, more of a real-world study, that was done. Researchers went in and looked at a condominium development outside of Los Angeles and measured, again, how people's proximity and their ability to kind of see other people and learn about them, how it influenced their attitudes. And again, they found, and as they put it, as people get closer together, the likelihood that they'll be friends goes up, but the likelihood that they'll become enemies goes up even more. And they term this environmental spoiling. You start to see all the things about the people around you that annoy you, you begin to resent them, you begin to dislike them. What we've seen with online communities is that these basic instincts, that dissimilarity tends to be stressed over similarity, and more information, more communication tends to lead to less liking rather than more liking. These things get exaggerated online. Because online we're constantly sharing information about ourselves through photographs, through messages, and so forth. In fact, the technology is actively designed to encourage you to share as much information as possible. And there's one study that showed that when two people communicate over a computer link, they tend to share 4 times as much information about themselves as when they communicate in person. It seems like when we communicate in person, we kind of understand what our parents probably used to. I remember being told this, don't talk about yourself so much. And that actually was good advice. People don't like to hear that. But we have this phenomenon that one set of researchers in the UK calls digital crowding. That because we're constantly learning about other people, we tend to come to feel more strained, more dislike them. And I'll read another quote from that research. No, I won't, because I didn't write it down. And so we have these deep tendencies in human nature. And then on top of that, we have another phenomenon that's very well documented in the psychological literature that shows that when we have unlimited information around us, we'll seek out information that confirms our existing opinions and beliefs and biases. It's called confirmation bias. As I say, it's been well documented. So when you go online, the ideal 20 years ago was, people will go out and they'll select lots of different viewpoints and look at opposing views and kind of become more broad-minded in this way. That's not actually normally how it works. People seek out information that confirms what they already believe. And as they do this, and this is also documented in the research, their opinions tend to become stronger and more extreme because they're confirming that all they're finding is stuff that says, you're right, you're right, you're right. And so I think this explains a lot about how divided we've become and how polarized in our politics and other things. Because again, the technology itself accentuates this aspect of human nature. Because not only are we seeking out confirming information, but companies like Google and Facebook and other social networks, they're feeding us personalized information that reflects those biases, because they're measuring what we believe, and then they're giving us the information that we're going to crave and we're going to go back to. So we no longer even have to make the effort to go out and find confirming information. It's supplied to us constantly through the technology. In one sense, I think all of this kind of confirms another old saying. And it's a very kind of bleak saying, one of the bleakest sayings, but familiarity breeds contempt. And unfortunately, in the way we've designed our new communication systems, we've created them in a way that amplifies that kind of effect. Now, it's true that I have been accentuating the negative here. And that's what nasty, brutish, and dumb was intended to do. And you can certainly make an argument that the things I'm talking about are tendencies, and for every negative effect I've discussed, you can point to evidence of positive effects. There are people who go online, who find interesting new people that they wouldn't have met otherwise, or find interesting information that they wouldn't have found otherwise. They do become broader-minded. They do become more empathetic. They find friends that they wouldn't have found before. They form communities that aren't nasty communities, but are very beneficial communities. So all of these things happen. But my point is that when we began this journey into digital media, because we believed these very idealistic assumptions that suited the business interests of the big internet companies, we kind of thoughtlessly gave the internet companies and their founders carte blanche in designing systems that actually now we can see were deeply, deeply flawed. And if we had come into this with more common sense, with a deeper appreciation of human nature, in a deeper skepticism about the way technology can be misused as well as used well, we probably would have made better decisions in the beginning about how we organized the internet as a commercial system, about how we organize social media, about how we use social media, and built in some safeguards against the kind of behavior that this technology seems to encourage. Because if I've been accentuating the negative, what all the research suggests is that the internet in digital media also accentuates the negative, while doing all the benefits as well. So to come back to the theme of the conference, what I would argue is that the best way to think about dawn and doom is not necessarily as these opposing viewpoints or as things that are totally unrelated and are just about whether you're an optimist or a pessimist or whatever, but we have to realize that taking an overly sunny view of technology, an overly utopian or idealistic view of technology, believing that it's a new dawn, is actually the best way to create the circumstances that bring us to a doomsday scenario. Idealism about technology, technological enthusiasm, kind of short circuits the deep thinking, the deep consideration of how the technology is going to play out that would allow us to create systems and create technologies that are more beneficial and that avoid some of the more negative consequences. In thinking about technology, I think we need to, in closing, I think we need to appreciate that technology is just an amplifier. It doesn't change human nature. It amplifies our good qualities, and it amplifies just as equally our bad qualities. And what we have to do, I think, is not offload responsibility for how technologies get designed and used to technological innovators who tend to be overly enthusiastic about it, and hence kind of rush ahead with systems that only later are seen to have all sorts of negative consequences, usually unintended consequences. So if technology both amplifies our good qualities and our bad qualities, we need to take more responsibility for how technology is designed, how it's used. We need to well, I don't know what the best way to put this is. We need to become, I guess, better stewards of our own technological future, because technology itself is not going to make us better human beings. That's something that only we can do, both individually and as a society. So thank you for your attention. Thank you.
So if folks would like to ask questions of Nick, you'd be willing to take them. I'd ask you to go and stand at the mic to ask them, please.
Yep.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name is Michael. I'm a career consultant at the CCO, Center for Career Opportunities. And as we know, solitary confinement is one of the worst forms of torture because you deny people access to communication. But at the same time, over-communication tends to kill. Example, cyberbullying. So with that being said, what is a sweet spot? What is the perfect balance for optimal communication?
It's a very good question. I wish I had a definitive answer. I think obviously some of it's going to vary with the personality type of the people we're talking about. But what I think, to give to relate this to the question of how technology influences communication, I think there are some things we know about the tendency of communication to encourage the worst in us, and that tends to happen when we can speak anonymously, for instance. A lot of cyberbullying is an example of that because you feel kind of protected. It's when we can speak impulsively and reach a broad audience at the same time. It used to be, we've all said things we regret. It used to be you'd say things you regret and there might be 2 people around you or 3 people around you or 4 people around you. Now it's the whole world and it's documented and it can reach all of them. So I do think that, there is definitely a sweet spot, and it's not, as you say, you don't want to be in isolation, but the sweet spot isn't constant disclosure of everything you're doing all of the time. And I think if we became simply more aware of that and created, some design techniques that would encourage people to think a little more before saying something, I think we could temper some of the negative impacts of over-communication.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mark G. I'm a senior here, and this is related to finding the sweet spot. In what ways and how much do you use your phone?
Still too much. But I only got my phone a few years ago, so well after most people had, because I had written a book called The Shallows about internet technology and how it influences our thoughts. So I was nervous about the smartphone from the beginning, but a weakness of character showed itself, and I went out and bought a smartphone. But one thing I don't I wouldn't present myself as a model for how to deal with these difficult struggles we all have with the technology, or many of us have. But one thing I decided to do at the outset was to not carry my phone with me all the time, because it seemed very, very odd to me when I didn't have a phone that everyone, just by default, decided this is something I have to carry with me all the time. And as you saw people adapt to the phone, not only did they carry it with them all the time, but more often they would actually walk around with it in their hand because, they, God forbid, they couldn't see the screen. And so what I think this new research that I've talked about emphasizes is that the more dependent you are on the technology, in particular your phone or social media, the more influence it has over your thoughts, the more salience it gains to you. And I think perhaps the best way to dampen that is to actually live part of your life without your phone on your person. To think before you go out to have dinner or go out with some friends or go out for a walk or go out for whatever, to think about whether the phone is really necessary, whether it's really going to improve that experience or actually deaden it. And I think if people did that more often, then the phone would have less of a negative impact on them. I also have not gotten deep into social media, so I don't have a Facebook account. I do a little on Twitter, but I try to keep my distance from it. And again, it's not because I don't see the value of these things, but it's because I know what the research says about the addictive qualities of these and how they get inside your head, and you find yourself kind of constantly going online because this social pull is so strong in us, and nobody wants to think that people that they know are talking and they're not involved in the conversation. So there are, in order to dampen the negative effects, I think you do have to give up some of the positive effects. You have to regulate your use of it. And finally, the last thing, and this is kind of, in one way, the simplest thing I think anybody can do, turn off all notifications on your phone so that you make the choice of when you look at something rather than the phone constantly telling you, look at me, look at me. I think, and I think this is a case where it's clear that companies like Facebook, and once they started realizing that they could send notifications rather than waiting for people to say, I think I'll go look at Facebook, suddenly they had much more control over our behavior and our thoughts. But it's a struggle for me, as I think it is for a lot of people.
Chris Clifton, computer science. Really enjoyed what you had to say, but one of the things I would curious about, when it comes right down to it, these internet companies, we reward them for entertaining us, not for educating us. And could it possibly be as simple as changing those incentives somehow so that what their value came from giving us what we really need as opposed to what we're currently rewarding them for?
In some ways, I think it's as simple as that, but saying it is simple, doing it is very, very difficult. I think one of the things that, again, and this goes back to if we had been a little more skeptical and a little more critical, we might have done a better job. But for some strange reason, we've decided that Facebook, for instance, to take one example, is not only the way to share banter and light chatter with friends, but it's also the way we'll get news and the way we'll form our political opinions. A communications technology that couldn't be more ill-suited to kind of thoughtful, considered, rational thinking about complex issues, suddenly by default, because it's there and it's always on, and Facebook is happy to entwine us in its network for as long as possible. Now, in an astonishing percentage of Americans, Facebook is their main source of news. So I don't, as you say, if we could somehow divide out the entertainment part and the informing part and the news gathering part and stuff, and maybe use different means, different technologies that are more well suited to each of these things, I think we'd be much better off. doing that now, backing up, is very, very difficult. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we can't, but I personally don't have, an easy answer for how we do that.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate coming here today. I've come a long way, halfway across the world. My name is Chris Ekeigwe. My primary background is that I'm a CPA, and I've been working in auditing for a long time. And one of the problems everyone in the room knows, accounting profession has had problems with scandals and scandals and scandals. And we look inwards and say, what really is the problem? We've got a lot of intellectual force in the, here, and yes, we can solve this problem. Some of us are working now and trying to look at something that we consider primal, which is control. Unfortunately, the aspect of control we have not looked at is the one that has to do with the individual, the self-control of the individual. And we have found out from psychology that self-control is primal to civilization. In fact, during the week, as we are working on the project, we looked about the work of Bymaster, the work of Robert Hare, and they've made it clearly. There's a statement that says, all human society has progressed to where we are today because of self-control. Now, today, you have said something that is significant. When you were talking, you said that the devices we have tend to suppress our self-control. That makes it profound, right? Now, if civilization depends on self-control of the individual, it means that when you deplete it, you could wipe out our collective effort to create wealth, to sustain society. If that is true, or could be true, is there not giving us a moral imperative that government should control the way we use funds? This may be a radical suggestion, given our ideal of freedom, but I want you to comment on that. If we continue to lose self-control continuously, we could lose our civilization as we know it. And the funds are actually contributing to self-control depletion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't want to get too far into the doom end, by the way. So the question, I assume everybody heard it, but by eroding our self-control, and I think that's one aspect of what the technology does, will it erode one of the foundations of civilization in the long term? I guess I'm not that pessimistic, because I don't think it necessarily erodes all self-control totally. But what I do think it does, and this is a matter of self-control, is that, and a lot of philosophers have talked about this, one of the most important aspects of our intellectual lives and our lives as thoughtful individuals is to control what we think about, to control what we pay attention to and what we don't pay attention to. And I think one of the most dangerous aspects of the rise of the smartphone and social media is that more and more people are allowing the technology to determine what they look at and what they think about. We're letting the phone and the screen and what's coming up grab our attention rather than imposing the discipline of making rational choices about what's worth thinking about at this particular moment and what's not. And so I do think that opens up, that dynamic, contributes to some of the polarization of society, some of the kind of emotionalism that's coming to replace more rational thinking, even dealing with complex issues. So I certainly think that there's a danger here. How big the danger is, I don't know, but I certainly hope that we become aware of it and attend to it and try to address those problems.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Stefan Pipero from IT. First of all, thank you for the excellent lecture. You made the interesting argument that communication does not equal community. And you supported it by the fact that we have better and better communication, yet we are getting worse and worse communities. Which got me thinking, is it possible that the effect is not really due to the more communication, but by the filters which are imposed on this communication? My example is the like button in Facebook. I mean, I understand you're not a heavy user, but you're familiar that there is a like button, but there is no dislike button in Facebook, which makes people express positive emotions, positive feedback extremely easily, but they have no way to express negative feedback nearly so easily. Is it possible that after years of this, we accumulated so much negativity that we started expressing it in other ways? Do you think if Facebook had a dislike button, we might be in a different world today? Thank you.
Well, the short answer would be probably not. Because I think Facebook now has an array of buttons, if I'm 7 different ones or something. For the whole array of human emotions right there. You've got the 7 buttons.
There is no clear negativity.
There's a very angry-looking person. But no, I'm not making light of your point. I mean, I don't know if that suppresses negativity and it comes out elsewhere. That seems to me maybe a stretch. But I do think that the like button, and it's clear, that the like button, which kind of Facebook stumbled on, became a hugely important tool to capture people's attention. And also, I think it shows the power of these platforms to regulate human communication and human speech. When you put in a like button, or you put in a retweet button, or you allow, a certain number of characters in a posting or whatever, you're regulating human speech. You're telling people you need to communicate in this particular way. And when those things become popular, they do have a very deep influence on the way we express ourselves. So not only are these tools ways to kind of encourage us to use the services compulsively, but more risky, it seems to me, is that they are determining the terms and the forms of our speech, which may not matter that much, again, as I said, if you're just bantering among friends. But when these tools have political power and they become used for broader social purposes, that both constrains, I think, the way we express ourselves and also gives incredible power to the technology companies that run these platforms.
Hello. So you were talking earlier about kind of like attention span with phones, and people that had their phones out, performed worse on tests and stuff. And I think this is kind of true in our society as a whole right now, in that our collective attention is just kind of getting a lot more easy to move on to the next thing. I mean, if you think about like all the kind of clickbait stuff on the internet, top 10 things you need to know about this, it's all surface level stuff that
Right.
It seems like so little things kind of dive into things. Do you think there's kind of a way that we can collectively wean off of this, or do you think we're kind of destined to keep going down that road of oversimplifying things until we're not really thinking about them deeply?
Yeah. Again, that's a very good question. I think in many ways you can see that there's continuity over the last 100 years with mass media in general, kind of reducing people's attention spans to fit the shape of the medium. So I think this is a long-term process that's accelerated greatly. I think, I think there's at least two possibilities beyond individuals making different choices and exerting more self-discipline. I think there's a possibility that we'll have a countercultural movement against this kind of technology. Usually, at least in modern history, when something gets cultural dominance, eventually there's a countercultural movement. It usually comes from the young, almost always from the young, in fact, that rejects that source of cultural dominance. So I wouldn't be surprised if some future generation just says no to social media, no to phones, and kind of rejects it entirely. And I kind of hope that happens. And as I say, I think it's something that could well happen. It seems like the other big mistake here, and other people would not call it a mistake, but is that we've built. It used to be that communications, media, and computing were kind of separate streams that ran through our lives, very important and kind of related to one another, but separate. What's happened in the last 10, 20 years is that they've all come together, and now they all pour through one thing, usually our phones, And the force that has the most power turned out to be media. And so we've used an advertising-based model for all of these very important kind of tools that we live with for communication, for computing, and for entertainment and media. And it's that kind of, when you're making your money from advertising, you tend to go to use these kind of appeals to very quick emotional connections with people, even if they have very, very little substance. So unfortunately, I think we've allowed this media business form to dominate too much of society, and I would hope we could back away from that. We used to pay for telephone service and telephone calls. We used to buy a little stamp to send a piece of mail, and we certainly didn't expect the mailman to open it up and read it and then feed us advertisements based on what he read. And so I think that has a long tradition, and maybe we could go, move in that direction with some aspects of this in order to open up more space in the technology itself for some deeper thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a junior here at Purdue University, and I was wondering, how could we redesign our technology so that it won't promote this positive feedback loop that you were talking about? So if
On the communications political side, or on the cognitive side, or
both.
both?
Sorry.
Wrong answer. Well, we just talked a little bit about it. There are structural issues here in how we pay for the service that influences the way it's designed. I think there is also, and I don't know if it's too late to do this or not, but there's, software programmers are very powerful. I mean, they can, theoretically, you could design a communications or information system that could tell when you really needed to think deeply and without distractions about something, and would reduce the speed and the flow of information, and then could also tell when you wanted to exchange information with a lot of people, because there are times when that's a very good thing, and increase the flow of information. So you could imagine information systems that varied the intensity and the flow of information and how much distractions were coming at you based on what you were doing at any given time. And then with the other side of the matter, you could, as I said, you have companies like Facebook and Google that are personalizing to a high degree flows of information. Some of that personalization is based on political viewpoints that they can infer from what you look at. If we had, a more pluralistic means of delivering information that didn't encourage us to get trapped in these so-called filter bubbles or to fall victim to confirmation bias, you could see how that might temper some of these ill effects. And there are many, I have to say, there are many software programmers that are working on things like that. The big question is, will we adopt those things? Will we change our own personal habits, or have they become so entrenched in us already that even if we have alternatives, we'll stick with what we already have come to know and unfortunately, I think, love?
Thank you.
Hi. What I seem to have noticed is that tonight a lot of the points you've made involve a need for a definitive sort of change to the way that we pursue media and social media specifically. But a lot of those things that we have today are sort of controlled by forces that are almost out of our hands. So I was just wondering, how do we actually go about changing these things, like as individuals, I suppose, instead of just waiting around, I suppose, for a counterculture movement to come about, or just hoping? What can we actually do to change things?
Well, I think there's personal behavior you can change. There's kind of developing an awareness of different legal approaches that might be taken and regulatory approaches. we see in Europe a very different approach to how we deal with many of these issues than we have in the US. Maybe we can learn something there in becoming more, becoming more of an activist, I suppose you'd say, in encouraging politicians, the justice system, the legal system, to kind of pursue some different approaches that might end up more productive. So, I think, again, coming back to my theme, one of the problems in being overly enthusiastic and overly idealistic is that we trusted the technology companies to take care of all of this, and we ceded our own political and legal and social power over them, and I think we need to grab that back. And if we do, I think then there are plenty of ways we can influence the future of how these things are designed and used. But as I say, it'll be a difficult process because we've gone so far without the necessary skepticism and critical thinking that it's always hard to back up when it comes to a complex technological system.
Thank you.
Hi.
We're running out of time, but I think we only have a couple more.
Thank you so much for coming. When you were speaking, I thought it was really interesting. You reminded me a lot of Socrates talking about the advent of writing, talking about how that would destroy our memory and have problems with our mind. And it seems there's a lot of similarity to the rise in popularity of smartphones and the rise of the written word. Do you think there's any differences or any major fundamental differences between something like the printing press and the advent of smartphones? And if not, is there anything that we can learn from something like the advent of writing to help us solve these problems in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference between writing in the printing press, the printed page, in the smartphone. And I think in one way Socrates argued that the arrival of reading and writing would erode people's memory and make them more susceptible to false arguments and stuff. And I think he was right. In many cases, people don't have, people did lose their ability to memorize long passages and so forth, and to challenge directly the speaker of some idea. On the other hand, I think what Socrates missed is the power of the printed page to involve people in deep arguments, in deep stories. And this is something I talk about in my book, The Shallows, but if you compare the printed page, a printed book, with a computer screen or a smartphone screen, you can have exactly the same text on each of those two media. They're both technologies, but the effects are totally different. The printed page is actually a kind of screen against the distractions that are always out there, trying to get a part of our mind. Almost literally, and certainly figuratively, when you open up a book and you read it, the only thing going on there are the words across the page. And so it kind of trains us. I think that was a technology that actually trained us to be able to pay deeper attention to complex and difficult ideas. Whereas you put that same information on a computer screen, and it has exactly the opposite effect, because the computer screen is sending all sorts of other information simultaneously to you and saying, hey, check your email, and here's a text, and here's a Facebook notification and stuff. And so whereas the printed page is an example of a technology that encourages attentiveness, the computer screen, particularly the smartphone screen, is an example of a technology that discourages attentiveness and actually trains us not to be able to pay attention and to be more easily distracted and more hungry for constant stimulation. So I think they, as technologies, even though they might deliver the same material, they're radically different in their effects on us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'd like to thank Nick Carr for joining us tonight. It's a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.